Are you happy because you lead a meaningful life, or do you need to be happy to have the capacity and energy to lead a meaningful life?
Welcome to the Stress Navigation Podcast. In this podcast, we'll talk about stress, science, and daily life. We'll interview experts in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, physiology, genetics, sociology, data analysis, and much more. Well, hello everybody. Today we have with us Meike Bartels, a full professor in genetics and well-being at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. She has done and does a lot. So let's start by saying that her main research focus is on individual differences in well-being. So why are some people well and some are not, even after facing similar challenges? She uses genetically informed approaches to understand the interplay between genes and environment and the development of well-being and resilience. And now with the progress of new measurement technologies, she's also using data coming in from our smartphones and wearables to study well-being in everyday life. She's also in the management team of the Netherlands Twin Register, where fascinating research can be done on twins, and is the former president of the International Positive Psychology Association. Now she's part of Stress in Action, and she's going to investigate the connection between stress and well-being. And you're quite the researcher, Meike, and we've known each other for a couple of years now, yes. So it's really a pleasure to have you on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, yes. It's nice to be here for sure with you, because indeed we worked together in the past, so that's nice.
Yeah, well, I think I'm just going to dive right into well-being and health. And I just want to know first how you define well-being and, in extension, happiness, and whether they're the same thing or not.
Yeah, that's always the starting question, and right. It's an interesting question, and actually you could spend hours talking about what is well-being, how could you measure it, what's the relation between different well-being aspects. We did a lot of research on that topic as well, but in general we define well-being as feeling well and functioning well in the context you're in. So it varies. It's not a stable trait. We looked at different measurements of well-being, so like happiness, like you say, or satisfaction with life, or quality of life. And in the end, we sorted out that they are strongly associated, a strong phenotypic correlation, and also a strong genetic correlation, so from a biological perspective. They are also connected, so we actually used the umbrella term well-being to cover it all.
Mm-hmm. But can you be well without being happy?
Well, there are fascinating data that people that show relatively high levels of depressive symptoms, for example, and still consider their life to be satisfactory, or they feel happy. So it's not the complete opposite end of the mental health spectrum of mental problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I find that really interesting. Yeah, because it makes me wonder about what makes up a healthy life. If you can still be depressed and still feel well, and then what makes up a healthy life?
Yeah, I think always that we should find this balance, this equilibrium. I sometimes get the question, if we talk about well-being, are you striving for this constant level of being happy, feeling well? And that's not the case. I'm just looking for the people that feel well and function well in our complex society. And that means that there are days that you don't feel that well, and other days you feel better. And you have to sort out actually the best of yourself. And it doesn't mean that you're on this constant high. You have interactions with people or contexts that makes you really happy, but are not like compatible to daily life. And you have to find this balance between, like I also call it, energy gainers and energy drainers. And well, the best of you is on this equilibrium of both of them.
Mm-hmm. It also makes me think of something that you research about hedonic well-being and eudaimonic, like hedonism as just looking for pleasure and that constant high, which, well, in my opinion, is unsustainable, and more eudaimonic, flourishing, something that already ancient philosophers, Aristotle has talked about, just, a life where challenges also make you grow, and going through the lows and coming up better after them is also going to be...
Yeah, exactly. And those the different factors are there, and they are also connected. We also studied that, so they're phenotypically connected, but there's also a genetic correlation of about 0.7 between hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. There's a lot of discussion about the direction of causation. Are you happy because you lead a meaningful life, or do you need to be happy to have the capacity and energy to lead a meaningful life. I think everything is always bi-directional. And for one person, it's more about feeling happy. It also depends on your age and on your own development. You try for happiness when you're like 14 or 15. You don't think too much about the meaning of your life. But when you're getting older, and especially like me, when you're like in your 50s, you think, well, okay, what's my contribution to the world? And that's dependent and independent of my own happiness.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that well-being, the definition of it changes throughout life, and the life course perspective is really important in considering this and accompanying people in their journeys. Is this definition common to the field, or does it include a personal touch?
It's not really common to the field. It includes a personal touch. The field, and that's with many fields, and I'm always for a bit where like less is more. Don't make it too complicated. You don't need 50 questions to sort out if someone feels well. So I'm a big fan of like very simple surveys, only one item or 5 or maybe 10, but constantly asking questions doesn't make, well, we feel like we make it more reliable, but in the end it's probably not, because everybody's different. So I'm actually striving for a simple way of assessing well-being, because I think people know quite well how they feel. So if you just simply, for example, ask on a scale from 0 to 10, 10 is the best life you can imagine, 0 the worst life, where on the scale on average is your life, or in general, or at the moment, you can like play around with that, but you know in the end. Well, and if I start like asking you 15 or 20 questions, you start thinking and thinking, and it's confusing, and you don't know what I'm talking about, and it just. Yeah. And then people say, people sometimes say that their life is worth a 7, and other people say their life is worth an 8, and maybe they mean the same thing. And yes, I think maybe they mean the same thing, but that's measurement error that we have in our measurement. So we need big samples, but I think big samples with simple questions are valuable at the beginning, and at some point, if you have answers from these samples, you can dive in more into.
Yeah, indeed. Like as an entry point, let's start simple, but then of course, well-being. Functioning has many domains, so we can think about our cognitive performance, our physical performance, how we behave in our social life, but that's, I guess, deeper.
And given the differences between people, it's really about, like you already said, a personal journey. It's what makes you happy, and that's not constant. It changes. It's different than for other people, but the only one who knows is you and yourself, how you feel. And that's also why I think we will never find it in an MRI scan, because feelings are from the brain, but it's not that easy to say it's from that area of the brain, for example. So that's why self-report is the only way to study well-being, is just to ask how you feel.
Yeah, and trust that.
Yeah.
I'm also curious.
And learn to trust yourself.
Yeah.
And that's part of the journey, that you know how you feel. And that sounds simple for many people, but sometimes people don't even know how they feel. And that's part of your journey. How do you feel, and what's actually, how do you interpret your own feelings?
Well, that's something I wanna ask you about a little bit later for sure. But first I want also to get like the definition of well-being maybe more culturally and worldwide, because I know you're an honorary professor at the School of Arts and Humanities at the Tsinghua College in Hong Kong. You've also been to Japan recently, to Brazil a couple of years ago. Was that because of your well-being research?
Yeah, that's all related to the well-being research. And I'm interested and fascinated by different cultures, because it's this balance between genetic predisposition and environmental factors. Fascinating is that we conducted a study over the past 2 years where we actually studied the heritability of well-being in different populations, also in Latin America, in Asian populations. And it's within countries, so it's hard to compare. But in the end, it all boils down around the 40%. We didn't specify the genetic components and also not the environmental components, so they could be completely different, but the balance of the importance of your predisposition versus your environmental exposure is not that different all around the world.
Well, then what does that mean exactly? Like, what does that heritability mean? Is well-being genetic? If I have 40% predisposition to well-being, what does that mean? 40% chances of being well in life?
No, the heritability really is a number. that explains the causes of differences between people. So it's a population statistics explaining the variance, how much of the difference between people are accounted for by genetic differences. You can't translate that to an individual score. So it really doesn't mean that 40% of your well-being is accounted for by your genes. It could be that you have a high genetic predisposition, meaning that it's easier for you to be happy, while others have a low genetic predisposition. But it just gives a number to the sensitivity of your biology, so we vary in that. It means that the environment is also very important. If 60% of the differences between people is accounted for by environmental differences, we can't ignore the environment. In this model, though, we completely ignore the interplay. So this is an additive model, and the reality is, of course, that your genotype makes you sensitive to certain environments, or your genotype makes you seek for certain environments that make you happy. You have the transmission from your parents. They create your environment. So there are all kinds of interplays that are not captured in this simple 40-60 division, but it's more a ballpark figure in, okay, how important are our genes and how important is the environment.
Yeah, conceptually we know this interplay is happening, but is the research already there, making models that can kind of track how that interplay is happening?
Theoretically, the models are there, but it's very, very complex to study these mechanisms in real life. You can imagine all kinds of laboratory studies, especially in animals, where you vary the environment. But in a human life, it's very complex to study these environments, these interplays. We try, but both the genetic component is very complex, and, well, like I always said, the environment is way more complex because there's nothing static in the environment, and there is no fixed structure. As we know, for like DNA, we have a fixed structure. So studying the environment is I think the biggest challenge we have.
Yeah, well, here at Stress in Action, our goal is to study stress, and we use technology, wearables, and smartphones to see how our feelings respond to stress exposure, how us being in different locations or with different people changes our physiology, our emotions, our behavior, our cognition. What do you think about this technology? Can it do this big task of tracking the environment a bit better, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that will be the only way, given that the environment is so complex and given that the environment is so variable, that the only way is doing constant assessments, so like passive sensitive and also active sensing. That's the way forward, and big data and a lot of people. That means big data, a lot of measurements in a lot of people, because then you will be able to find the differences between people. And this constant, especially passive sensing, has the beauty that people tend to forget about it. So you get a really like real life observation. But it will not be easy. It will take a while. We need large samples first to build the models and then validate them and then implement them.
What are some examples of this technology and these measures being used in well-being research?
Well, we have a study indeed, like you mentioned, with mobile phones, where we do an EMA study. So we ask people how they feel 8 times a day, 7 days a week, in 4 times a year, in every season. And in this study, we also have a lot of passive sensing. So the movement of people, light exposure, noise exposure, GPS location. As soon as you have that, you have this like wealth of data that are related to the location. You could study these data for years to sort out.
The life course perspective as well, and see how it changes.
Exactly, and then of course, what would be very nice to add more physiological measures to these assessments as well, because in the end, like you talk about stress, and you have like the feeling of stress versus the physiological reaction to stress are two interesting systems that are of course related, but they're not like linearly easily related. So in the end, hopefully we get to a point that we could also do these physiological assessments like on a constant basis. Not being too invasive for people. That's a nice challenge.
The benefits, we see that this wealth of data can be really interesting to really gather information about the phenotype of well-being or any other health outcome or phenomenon. What do you think are the pitfalls of having so much technology?
I don't see it as a pitfall. I think we should not expect too much. I think we should realize that effect sizes are really, really tiny. I simply say if effects would be big, we already would have found the answer or solved the problem. So we didn't for many things, so it's very complex. Effect sizes are tiny. And I think beauty of research, we should accept that we could do a lot and invest a lot of money and then do not find anything. And people say you don't find anything, and then I say no, you actually excluded a lot of things that can't be the answer. So that's also research. So I think embracing complexity, embracing slowness, and embracing null findings is the way forward. But it means we need a lot of time, we need a lot of money, and we need a lot of people. And we make tiny steps. But,
and in the meantime, I feel that there's just like all models are wrong and some are useful.
Exactly.
And in that sense, this technology can just be useful for you to gain some self-understanding, some sort of correlation of when you feel better depending on who you're with or where you are. Just help you navigate.
And then you see like the big jump we made, for example, in the field of genetics over the past 50 years. Nobody would have imagined that 50 years ago. Then we had like the big stories in when we just had the human genome, as if we would solve everything within a couple of years. And I think both perspectives are not reality. So first of all, I think we're going to make big steps, especially if you talk about machine learning, big data, all that kind of stuff. But we shouldn't promise too much. And especially as researchers, we should also be very clear on what our added value is. I always tend to say I'm a well-being researcher, and that means that I know better what we don't know. Because I thought about it more than other people. But it's not that I know more. I just know better that we know only a little, and what we know and what we don't know.
Well, that's a really valuable perspective, like, and also like humility within the scientific world. Like experts are the people who also know how much we don't know.
Exactly, I think, and if we're more clear about that, the expectations are better. We don't get like overclaiming things. I think it's also better to see how important research is, and that should not be valued on what we find. It should be valued on how clear we are about what we don't know.
That's a really cool thought. Then you mentioned before about trusting yourself, and also in relation to this technology, I find it interesting that maybe a bit scary that we might rely more on the data to tell us something about ourselves than what we can just learn about ourselves by paying attention. What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I always think about the moment that someone asked me, shall we go for lunch? And then I always look at my watch. And they say, why? Why do you look at your watch? I say, well, I look if it's lunchtime. But why should it be lunchtime? I just want to go for lunch. And are you hungry or not? So for me, it's not important because I can eat always and I eat anything. But in the end, that's the same thing. I think it helps you. So feedback and data help you. Help you to learn about your feelings. But in the end, it should not be necessary. But surprising to me, I think most people don't know themselves. So there is like a world to win with these data and saying, okay, hey, you are stressed. Are you aware of that? Or you're angry, or you're sad, or over the past day you moved way less. How are you doing? So the checking in on you and the attention, even if you get it from your watch or your phone or whatever, still feels like someone cares about you. And that's a very important aspect of well-being and how do you feel and about self-management. So I think it's crucial and it will have a lot of added value. On the other hand, people vary a lot. So some people are completely insensitive to these triggers. I always say that I'm insensitive, but I'm still annoyed when my watch says you have to stand up. Yes, I have to stand up. So I think it's very helpful for people.
Well, I also find this like technology to be very useful for the people who want to engage with it that way, and there'll be people who really don't need it, and in that sense we have to just use it and learn and see what we want it for.
Yeah, on the other hand, people that say they don't use it, I always will say just try. And of course there should be like a lot of improvements, but like the fact that it's optimized every time and it's like getting more and more personalized, I think everybody can learn from it, and then you can the thing that's lacking, to my opinion, now is that there's not much way to give feedback yourself. So you like with movement, you can say you stand up every hour. That's a static thing, and the same for mental and physical health. They give you standard numbers right now, and that should be more adjustable to your personal lifestyle. And that will be the future, of course.
Yeah,
it's just in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, here at Stress in Action, we're about stress, and I'm also curious about the definition of stress within the field of well-being. But first, just for the fun, we have a recording of some person talking about what they think stress is in relation to well-being. I went to this festival and I just asked a person, and I wanted to think what you thought of this person's definition. And yeah, we can just go on from there. Hey, so what do you think stress is, and what do you think it is in relation to well-being?
I think stress comes from hostility and the world surrounding us being hostile to us.
Wow, interesting.
And how it affects to productivity.
Well-being, how does it affect
well-being? It can ruin your well-being in a blink of an eye.
Okay, nice. Well, thank you for that answer.
Welcome.
So yeah, what do you think about that answer?
Well, I think it's a very nice real life example of collecting data. It's interesting because the reflection of this person is that it's completely driven by an external factor. So
the world being hostile.
It's done to me. So I don't play a role. I just have to protect myself. If from the field of genetics, I think there's more under your control or under your genetic predisposition than people often think. So it's not that the world comes to you or that the environment is just a random factor. You play a substantial role yourself. Maybe not always conscious, but you play a substantial factor yourself. But yeah, it's a personal opinion, and I think for stress that is the answer, because for this person it's this factor, while for someone else it's probably a completely different factor, and that is the beauty but also the complexity of it.
Yeah, and he says that stress can ruin your well-being in the blink of an eye. Is that what people think in the field of well-being, or what you think that stress?
Yeah, well, that's interesting that you say is that in the field of well-being and in general, well-being is always considered to be the end point. So something we pursue, something we thrive for, well-being. I think well-being should be the beginning. So in this case, I think if you feel well and you function well, you know who you are way more capable of being resilient against stressing factors, or maybe you will not be in the situation that you will be really stressed because you know I shouldn't go there, I shouldn't do that because that makes me feel stressed. So I think well-being could also be the beginning. But for some people, indeed, stress is a big factor that influences how they feel. So that's why people see it in that way.
Yeah, but I agree with you in the sense that it depends also on how much you know yourself and where you can be. Many of the things that stress us out are actually very meaningful, right? So having kids or personal development projects, and in that sense you can deal with the stress because you know that's what you want.
Exactly.
It's when you feel like you don't have that control, or maybe you don't have that desire to be in this place, that it can overwhelm you.
Exactly. I think that the factor control is important, and the factor judgment is important. So to judge for yourself, is this a situation or something I want to do? And of course, it doesn't mean that life is completely under control and that you're always stress-free if you know yourself. But some people, and that's also with genetic predisposition, some people tend to always run into these situations because they're not like that capable of judging for themselves or do proper goal settings or these kinds of things. Some people like to challenge. I always also say I always like to live on this balance of stress, non-stress. Otherwise, my life gets boring. Other people in my environment, they say, well, what kind of life do you live? Why do you do that to yourself? It's always busy. It's always full. Don't you want more like free time or less stressed work? I said, no, I think I would consider it to be boring immediately. So it's also like a personal preference.
Yeah. Then it makes me think, then what's something small in everyday life that stresses you out? Like for me, I don't have a kickstand in my bike, so then I always have to find a spot where, and then there's always people, all the bikes, and it's so stressful to find a place to park. You know, that's like something little. What's something for you?
Ooh, every day? I don't know. And the daily. Well, I like control. So uncontrolled situations are probably not my favorite situations. I'm not that easily stressed, actually. Is
that because you have a high predisposition to well-being, or is that something unrelated?
Yeah, I think it's a part of my the Dutch simple idea of how important everything we do in the world actually is. So in the end, like I said before we had this chat, the sun will rise anyway tomorrow. In most cases, and the contribution. I love to see the science in general and my research group, what we do, as a huge contribution. In reality, I know it's just this like tiny thing, and we can make it very big and very important. But if a PhD student is stressing out, I say, well, let's go to the train station and ask someone if they know us. The answer is for sure no.
Yeah.
if we explain what we do, if they know what we do, understand it, no. If they think it's very important, well, some might say yes, some might say no, but don't make it too big. But value. So that's also like your personal journey. You should do what you value to be important to the world, but don't see it as if you're like changing the world, because it's.
I find that really funny, because then I saw the other day a meme where it's just like, before every meeting, we should start just saying, guys, we're on a rock in the middle of space, very tiny, you know, there's so many species and things going on around us, just to set the tone of like what we're going to do and like how important it actually is.
Exactly.
I think that's a good way to be resilient. Yeah, for sure. Just think, okay, what I'm doing is important, but if it doesn't go through, it's not the end of the world.
It's near the end of the world. And exactly, you still should consider it to be important. Otherwise, it shouldn't be useless. And sometimes people, if you say too often, well, we're only like this tiny part of the puzzle, I think, well, is
it's
it
meaningless?
But
scary.
No, that's the other side of
the balance.
Yeah.
So when did you start having these thoughts? Like, tell me a little bit about your trajectory. Yeah, how did you get into well-being and coming into this way of life? Yeah,
well, I did my. I wanted to be a medical doctor. We had this lottery system in the Netherlands. We still have, but when I was young, it was based on random numbers, which was good for me because I didn't have very high grades at school. So it didn't help if it would have been about my grades. But I never got in. I tried 3 times, and I that was something I always wanted to do. Also because nobody asked me what I really wanted to do, and my mother was a medical doctor, so I think I would have been a really bad doctor. Because I wanted to be a medical doctor, but I was not really interested in patients and not in illness. So I don't know where it came from, but I was interested in being a neurosurgeon because I loved the brain. Didn't work out. I started studying pharmaceutical sciences. And that time I only had the idea that I would end up to have a pharmacy. And I thought, well, I don't want to store.
Interesting. So, I've seen you now behind.
Yeah, but now when I now know the field of pharmacogenetics or the field of doping and Olympics, for example, I would be like totally happy in research in that area as well. I think, but didn't work out, and then I didn't know what to do at all. I was always fascinated by genetics. That was my favorite topic at school, and I loved to look at people and families. And so I thought, okay, genetics is interesting. And then someone pointed me that there was the Netherlands Student Register at the VU studying genetics in relation to psychology and physiology. So that's when I started at the department. I had to study psychology that I never thought about doing, but I actually loved part of it, not all, but and then could do physiological psychology, now called biological psychology, at the department, and did my PhD there. With a focus on childhood psychopathology, the development of emotional and behavioral problems during childhood, and cognitive abilities, development, genes, environment. Really, really nice. I really enjoyed it. Did a lot about rater bias, who's the best observant of behavior in children. Really liked that, because how do you measure things? What is the reliability? But in the end, I was fascinated by the disbalance between what we report. So, like in the newspapers, everybody's talking about the mental health of young people, especially now, but also back then. And about mental problems, and that there are like many problems, and the data show that the majority of people is doing well. So I thought, well, we always use that as a control group. Why don't we study why people feel well?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when I started well-being research. Was not easy in the beginning, because people thought, what are you doing? Why focus on happiness? What a nonsense. So most of the first grant applications were rejected. Linking it to genetics sometimes gave very negative reactions, because people thought genetics and biology is important to solve diseases, but why should we look at normal people? But, well, the world changed, because I think the word well-being is now everywhere. Mm-hmm. So, and that's not due to me. That's just because I think that we realize that there's more to it.
Yeah, it should be a starting point, not an end point.
It should be a starting point, not an end point. And, of course, like the World Health Organization changed their definitions way back already. But
it used to be like the absence of symptoms or problems. And
exactly. And so, that's how it started. And
but then there's so many ways to talk about well-being, and it seems like we talk about it a bit philosophically, a bit more psychologically, but your main focus is genetics. So why do you choose that over, I don't know, philosophy or psychology?
That's why I think my fascination by individual differences, and in the field of well-being, like 90% of the studies is still group comparisons, mean level comparisons. I think a mean level is the most empty number that we can get, because it doesn't say anything, because the variation can be like in all various ways to give the same mean. So the differences between people and the genes and the genetics, it's just what you see. Mm-hmm. If you observe people, you can't ignore genetics anymore. And so combining that is... was a very nice new way of understanding well-being.
Yeah. It makes me think a lot about in this conversation of nature versus nurture. And it's still hard for me to grasp the role that genetics plays versus environment, or even if versus is the word, like if we can actually draw a line between the difference between what's happening in my body or what's happening outside. Like bidirectionality is so constant. Yeah. And it makes me think, like, for example, I consider myself a happy person, but I've also seen and still experienced a lot of pain and bad moments. I think I've learned well how to live and handle life. And most of this knowledge has come most from psychology, going to therapy, reading philosophy, even listening to songs that just explain life. It's like, wow. So then I'm really curious, what does well-being, the genetics of well-being, add to the mix?
Knowledge. Mm-hmm. Simple. I think the more knowledge we have about anything, the better the world will be. I think it's a factor to understand that everybody's different. Genetics is crucial.
As a doorway to explain that we're
as
all
a doorway
different.
to explaining and accepting individual differences. So and it sounds simple. Everybody says, well, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, and we have like big teams and a diversity officer and whatever. But that doesn't mean we embrace individual differences really in real life, because it means that you are different than I am. So everybody that you talk to is different than you are, meaning that everything you do is different than someone else is doing. Everything you like is different than someone else likes. And I think showing these genetic differences, and that genes do matter, is a step into this acceptance that everybody is different.
Oh, I definitely like that you say that. It's not necessarily before we start applying it in like the clinic or whatever. It's just most to understand how the world works, and just a very clear way to just know.
Yeah,
the
know
differences
and
are there.
accept, and in that sense, I really think that the genetic studies nowadays will be the step to more personalized approaches in the future. What works for whom?
How so? How would that work?
Well, I think that for example, the polygenic scores that you can build on the large GWAS studies that are unreliable for most of things, especially for well-being at the moment, because we're just don't have the samples and the findings yet to claim that it's a reliable score. But in the end, we will. I'm completely sure that we get more data and we get that's more reliable. And that's just information that can be added to the mix and can help understand why some things that make a lot of people happy don't make you happy.
Yeah.
And I think unhappiness comes frequently from the expectation that something should make you happy. Like this one size fits all. So you don't feel happy, go running.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure if running is for you the answer to get a better well-being. You don't know, but it's constantly everything you read, everything you hear. You always hear like do yoga, go running. You tried, you get more miserable. Then you think it's your fault.
Body is not made for
but
it.
maybe it's simply indeed not your biology, and having that answer at some point. On the other hand, I think it just adds information to the mix. But if you do your personal journey well, you don't need the hard DNA measurement, but it helps to understand.
Yeah. So is it already being applied in the clinic, for instance, this kind of information of well-being, or is not something that
No, not
there?
really. Not at all. No, I think the only examples I know of really applying genetics in the clinic at like population genetics is like the polygenic score for cardiovascular disease, for example, in some countries and for some populations, which is one of the big drawbacks, of course, of what we know currently.
Do you see it getting there into the clinic, or is it something more like someone is curious and they go and they get tested, or how would it look like if you had to dream?
I had to dream. I think I'm a person that likes to have information about the world and about myself. So I would be a big fan of like large scale testing and having your like passport of knowing who you are. And from a pharmacogenetic perspective, that's easy. I think I actually don't understand why we don't have it yet for many things, because we know a lot about it and we just don't implement it because you get privacy, you get people that have like science fiction ideas about it. But in the end, I would be fan of knowing what is good for me or not, and genetics is a part of that.
Yeah, I think with diet especially, like if you could know like what your body is more sensitive to or more open to when it comes to what you eat.
Yeah.
That would be great information.
It also, that's another field that that it's surprising because physiology is very complex and food is very complex, but still I think we know way more, but we just don't use it, and we get all these one size fits all diets for people and things that should be good for you or bad for you, and
Yeah, it's funny though, because then I think of like ancient philosophers from many different cultures, and I think they got many things right about well-being back then, like healthy body, healthy mind, eat well, rest well, have good social relationships. That's not new. So does that sometimes surprise you that we already knew back then and we're still trying to kind of figure it out now? Or
no, it doesn't surprise me, because in the end I think studying anything, especially mental health in human being, is by observation and self-observation. So they just saw it happening or did feel it happening in their own life. The thing only is that the definition of, like you say, having good connections is then changed to a one size fits all, but good connections for you are not the same for me.
Some people need 10 friends all the time, and some people are happy with seeing one person twice a week.
And so we observed something complex, then turned it into something relatively simple, and now we're back to understand that it's complex, and then it takes time to understand what it really means.
Yeah.
And same sleep is another example. I think that the pressure on sleep and the one size fits all ideas about how many hours sleep are healthy for individuals, I think it's nonsense. Well, maybe not. I'm not a sleep expert, so maybe sleep experts now say that I talk nonsense, but it's saying it's 7 hours or saying it's 5 hours, or Well, look at your own sleep. I think I don't have a similar night. It's always different, and it's more or less, or it feels deeper or not, or whatever.
Yeah, it's such a hard balance to, because you have to get kind of guidelines to people,
Yeah.
right? We all are born without knowing things, and then you
Yeah.
got to kind of give guidelines, but then you also have to know that things are very complex, and yeah, I guess that's the challenge. That's
Yeah.
and I guess
And I
that's-
think that's where the sensing
yeah.
and then the personal feedback and the algorithms come in very handy, because in the end, the data will tell me how
What's good for me.
what's good for me.
Yeah.
And,
Do you think that it's going to become too individualized and it'll make people then forget that also well-being is a communal thing, for instance, that I'm also well if you're well, or if anyone is well. So
yeah, but no, I don't think so, because it starts with you. I think you should feel well, and then you have the extra capacity, energy, potential to contribute to the world and to other people. So it should start at an individual level. But it doesn't, so it's an individual level and an individual journey, but you don't have to do it on your own and by yourself, because the best way of learning is in contact and in reflection with other people and in different contexts. So we really need people surrounding us, and we contribute to other people's life in that way.
yeah, I like that. Okay, I also was curious about talking about well-being from a societal perspective. Like, we're talking now that it's an individual journey, but also we're affected by the world, and we need other people in our lives, and it's always in relationship to others. And of course, it's a personal effort to maintain a healthy lifestyle, to overcome challenges, to flourish and develop. But yeah, just the world has a great impact on us. And I wanted to know, for example, about this life. We're in a consumer society, and this consumer society, well, it kind of goes against, I feel like, many emotions that are associated to well-being, which are satisfaction, contentment, gratitude. If there's always something that we need to buy or something that is missing, how can we feel satisfied? How can we feel grateful or content? I was just curious about your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, it's a very nice question. I have my biggest dream, and probably will not happen in my lifetime, is that we really will get a paradigm shift. We currently have, like you described it, and I call it the well-being society. So you have to tick all the boxes, or you have to buy anything you like, and then in the end you will be happy. You need the proper schooling, you need friends, a house, the clothes everybody likes, and everything. And in the end you will be happy. And the big paradigm shift should be that we will build a society based on well-being. That means, and that's actually, if you think about it, it's huge. So that means changing the complete schooling system. Because our schooling system is now about exams, it's about mistrust, it's about testing people. And a schooling system should be about learning. It should not be one size fits all. It should be about learning. It should be about learning out of your intrinsic drive instead of any external drive or external factor. Well, and that's the schooling system. Any system is actually, it is also not, we can't hold it up. So it's not that I only dream about it. I think it's crucial that we change, and we change back to what is a human being, how do you feel well. I always say children are born, and then in the first couple of years, 2 to 3 years, they're very biological. So they are angry, they cry, they eat, and we support
no
that.
Control at all, yeah.
Yeah, we tend to support it. We don't tend to change it. We tend to support it. And then we put them in the school system. They're getting older, and then we put a one-size-fits-all. You have to do this. This is good. You have to learn this.
Fulfill these requirements.
Yeah, fulfill all this. And we're drifting off from the fact that the most important thing is that this individual is feeling well and functioning well. And what it is and how it feels, that's the journey from the beginning onwards.
Yeah.
So yes, our society is not at the right track and should be dramatically changed. And it doesn't mean that we have to rebuild the house. I think we should build a new house completely from a new fundament.
Yeah, where it's not about meeting expectations that are placed on us. Like, you need to wear these clothes, you need to have this phone, you need to have this car, you need to learn these things, but flip it around. It's like, what do you want to learn? What do you want to wear?
Exactly.
What do you want to... Yeah. And then Well, before we close, I also wanted to ask you about the idea of recovery, which I think is also very important in well-being. And we mentioned a little bit before, like life is always going to come with its difficulties, and its well-being is not about avoiding or not experiencing the bad stuff, but about recovering from it. What is the connection between recovery and well-being? Is there research done on that?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. Of course, there is research on resilience. We have been studying resilience also with people from Stress in Action. It's very complex. It starts with the fact that you only know that you're resilient if you have ever had to use it.
Yeah.
So, and a lot of people, luckily, have never been in the situation that they really had to be resilient. So that's problematic from the beginning. And there's a lot of variation. So some people bounce back easily, some people do not bounce back, some people don't know if they bounce back. So I think it's very fascinating, and it's crucial, and it's also with like the society based on well-being starts when people feel well. You feel better. I think you're in the end more resilient, and or you're not putting yourself in a situation where you need it, or you know who you are and you feel well, so you can cope with a lot more, because there are of course situations that are not under control. So I think it's crucial, but lots to learn.
Yeah, I also think that maybe bouncing back to what things were like before you experienced a bad event or had, trauma or whatever, that's hard, because you might not ever get back to where you were. And I feel recovery in that sense, from a very medical perspective, like if you have a cold and then the symptoms disappear, your fever, your runny nose, and you say you recovered. But from a more mental well-being perspective, recovering isn't going back to the time where you didn't have the symptoms. Maybe you still have some lingering things going on, but you find new meaning.
Exactly. The question is if that's necessary. If you need to, that's what society expects. That's where society again comes in. But the well-being society is expecting a lot from you. You have to be here. You have to do that. Why? I think the simplest question is why, and I think one of the problems that people tend to go back or bounce back to where they came from, while that might not be their situation. So it's also part of the journey that you realize, okay, I've been into that situation, or I had this trauma, or this happened to me. What did I learn, and how can I actually go on into whatever? And that also means that we should embrace, and that's part of the society based on well-being, we should embrace the unknown way more. And that means that we should trust each other way more. And embracing the unknown is the beauty of life, but it's very complex for us nowadays because we tend to have everything under control.
Yeah, I think that's also a big thing with science, that we try to look for this certainty, but then it's just everything is so uncertain. I think that stresses a lot out. Looking for a certainty in a world, in a life that will always be uncertain. So maybe the way to be less stressed and feel better is to just navigate
and see the beauty of uncertainty.
Yeah. Well, that's what we do here, or what we want to do with the Stress Navigation podcast. We want to kind of guide the listener and talk to experts about what it's like to, in this case, be well. And it was really interesting to have you on the show, Meike. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. It was a very nice conversation.
And to the listeners, thanks for listening. In future episodes, we will continue to talk to different experts to explore stress, technology, health, and being human. So stick around for more.